Welcome to Wales Tech Week 2021. Thank you to our partners. Enjoy the session.
Hi everybody and welcome to Wales Tech Week. My name's Andrea Green. I work for Costain and I'm going to be the chair and host of this session, which is Joining the Dots, Harnessing Energy Technology for Inclusive Decarbonised Transport Networks. I've stepped in a bit last minute. We've had some technical problems in the background, so hopefully I'll do a good job and it'll be a really exciting debate today. So we'll start with some opening remarks, we'll have some short introductions from the panel, and then there'll be a great discussion and I'll just close out. So what are we here to talk about today? Well, clearly the Economic Action Plan sets out a really bold vision for inclusive growth that levers investment in decarbonised transport networks to maximise the potential that we have with new industries and create unprecedented opportunities for our communities in the new green economy. Clearly, with COP26, with the climate emergency, we are at a turning point as a nation, with an ever-increased demand for power, coupled with the need to source and use energy more sustainably. And we all have a really clear desire for change. So government and industry need to work more collaboratively to find the right solution for Wales. So in this discussion, we'll join the dots between clean energy and transportation. We're going to explore the potential of a holistic approach and revolutionise the way we plan and deliver cleaner, greener transport systems today, while leaving a great legacy for our future generations. So I'd like to start by introducing our panellists. And here we go. Here's all our fantastic panelists. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And if we could just start with some light introductions. So I'm just going to go around my screen. Let's start with Matt Jones from Welsh Government. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Jones. I'm a transport official for Welsh Government. I was involved in the M4 Relief Road, then moved on to the Lord Burns South East Wales Transport Commission and their work on alternatives. And now I look after the development unit in Transport for Wales that is tasked with implementing those recommendations. Associated with that, I'm involved in the metro schemes, and associated with that, it all kind of goes upstream really to decarbonisation, and that's where the new ministerial portfolio is, and looking at how we tackle all the issues you've just described in our transport plan for the next 5 years plus going forward.
Thank you, Matt. And it's really exciting to see Wales leading the way in that respect and looking at transport networks quite differently. So welcome to the panel today. And Jamie?
Hi, everybody. So Jamie Cahoon, I am the Transport, Energy and EV Advisor for Costain. I've got 15 years experience in the energy sector, working primarily for EDF in downstream large business supply and energy services. The last 3 or 4 years, my focus has been on clean mobility with plenty of experience in EV charge point systems, and most recently in hydrogen fuel cell EV feasibility. So at Costain, we're looking to support clients in Wales in building strategic roadmaps for delivering clean mobility solutions, as well as, I suppose, designing and delivering energy and transport systems to support this transition. We're doing a lot of sort of related work in Wales already. We're leading on the South Wales Industrial Cluster. We're part of the Welsh Local Government Association's Transition and Recovery Support Programme. We're working with E.ON and Scottish and Southern Networks to deliver electricity network resilience as a service. We're also supporting Welsh Wales. I'm sure that Ben will talk about this a bit further later on, as he did this morning, around High Value, the hydrogen production facility project. Plus, we've just completed a study for Cardiff Council and Welsh Government looking at potential fuel-grade hydrogen demand for road transport in South East Wales, which connects very strongly to the High Value project to build downstream demand for any hydrogen production. So looking forward to a great debate with everyone in the next hour. So that's me.
Thank you, Jamie. And it's just it's great to hear how much we're doing in Costain, but I know there's so much other things that are happening in industry as well, that it's happening across the board. In most corporations, industries, engineering organisations are working really hard to drive that decarbonised future. So thank you for joining us today. And we have Steve. Hi, Steve.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello, everybody. Good to be here. My name's Steve Ward. I am the Decarbonisation Programme Manager at Transport for Wales. We're essentially a company set up by the Welsh Government to deliver lots of different transport projects across Wales. My focus so far has largely been on electric vehicle charging and how we can fill in some of the key gaps in Wales' electric vehicle charging infrastructure and increase the number of charge points. Also, at the moment, I'm assisting the Welsh Government in all aspects of decarbonisation policy development. So it's a very exciting time to be here.
Fabulous, thank you, Steve. And Kate from Capital Law. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Andrea, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Kate Evans, and I'm an associate solicitor at Capital Law. I'm the energy sector lead for Capital Law, and I sit within the construction energy and projects team. My particular specialism within law is renewable energy and decarbonisation projects. And I currently work on the South Wales Industrial Cluster project as a project partner alongside Costain. And our role in this project is just to kind of advise on project aims and the legal aspects of decarbonisation. My interest in today lies within the legislative requirements surrounding the decarbonisation of transport and what needs to be achieved from that perspective to make this goal a reality. Thanks, Andrea.
Fabulous, Kate, and great to welcome you. And Nigel. Hi, Nigel. Nigel from, I think you're going to bring quite a different dimension to this discussion, so welcome if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. So I'm Nigel Morris from Specific, which is a research outfit in Swansea University. I'm currently Business Development Manager with Specific, and Specific look at innovative ideas, buildings especially, which will generate energy, store energy, and then release energy for the operation of the building, and in this instance, in this context, for transport. So my background with the university was going back to 2011 when we first tried an electric vehicle. We put our first electric vehicle on fleet in 2012, and we've grown the EV fleet since. And so we have 70% of our vehicle fleet now is full electric, and we also have one hydrogen fuel cell vehicle on fleet. I've worked outside of the university. Then we got together some sort of like minds. Thought if we're doing this in the university, the city county, they'd probably be doing it too. So we got together, got a little group together under the umbrella of Low Carbon Swansea Bay. Met one or two of the panelists before at the events that we hold, and the idea was to joined up thinking, maybe share good practice and see if we could build a little network of experience. And that's grown a little bit further now down into the South West Wales region too, looking at EV infrastructure. So yeah, really looking forward to today.
Great, thank you, Nigel, and great to hear what a strong part academia in Wales is playing in our energy transition. I know Swansea working really hard, as are Cardiff and other universities around Wales. So it's really important that we bring in those academic partners to this discussion as well. Now, we do have one more panellist today who I can see is having some technology challenges. Ben from Welsh Water, can you hear us, Ben? No, unfortunately, Ben's still struggling with his connection. So if he's able to join us, obviously we'll do the introductions when that happens. So again, thank you all for joining us here today. So, and I'm hoping this is going to be quite a healthy debate. Just opening up, I think one for you, Matt. You know, clearly Welsh Government has a really important part to play. What do you think more Welsh Government can do to accelerate the transition to a clean network? Clearly, there's lots of technology in development from universities like Nigel, from businesses like our own. We've got a legal framework, etc. But how can we accelerate that transition, and what part can Welsh Government play in that?
Yeah. I think the big challenge from Welsh Government back to industry and the public, I suppose, really is set out in the new Wales Transport Strategy, and it's almost to follow the waste hierarchy here and reduce in the first instance. You know, we consume a lot of energy. The way things are going, that's increasing, and that totally flies against decarbonisation and where we need to be by 2050 to achieve net zero. That's why the Wales Transport Strategy that's recently been published sort of looks to flip that really and looks to reduce the need to travel. You know, especially in the context of post-COVID, where we're all working online as we are here now. There's a big push to lock in some of those changes and reduce the amount of energy that we're consuming. So that's kind of the starting point really for transport. And then after that, it's modal shift, changing the modes that we use. It's quite a hot topic at the moment in terms of roads and private car use. That was all there in the Wales Transport Strategy. That's becoming a lot more tangible with the news yesterday of the roads review, looking at roads projects and pausing all roads projects until they've been analysed through that lens. So that's quite interesting that ministers are firming up on this. But you could kind of see that coming with the new climate change ministerial portfolio and transport sitting within that. I think ministers are taking some real strong action in looking to achieve those decarbonisation targets. And the target that's really putting pressure on us is 2030, in my view. 2050, I think we're going to get there through EVs. But 2030, I'm much less confident, especially in Wales, that we can transition the fleet to achieve the halving of surface transport emissions that we need in that period, purely by EVs or hydrogen alone. So that moves the game on to reducing consumption, and that's through, as I say, different ways of working that we reduce the need to travel, or travel demand management is a bit of an inconvenient truth that we're going to have to start looking at measures that do that. And there's a full spectrum of what that could mean, from the top end being road user charging, paper mile systems that could be tailored into time of day and whether you go into a city centre. But that kind of system would have to be on a UK-wide basis. And then the other end of the spectrum is much sort of softer stuff like road reassignment. Again, a topical measure in Cardiff, Castle Street closing to general car traffic and now being announced to reopen. That's the softer end, but it's a lot more readily implementable and lower cost if money's tight. So yeah, I think looking at the back to basics on how much energy we use in the first place is the starting point for us before we then get on to obviously all the great work that's going on in terms of renewables. Yeah,
absolutely. And from Steve, from a Transport for Wales perspective, it's really interesting to hear from Welsh Government about that back to basics, reducing the need to travel and the modal shift that's required. Clearly, Matt putting those measures in place that are going to reduce people's reliance on the car is really important. And I, for one, have benefited post-COVID, being able to work more from home and work locally. So for many of us, there have been the plus sides, as well as obviously all of the really big challenges we've had as a nation. But Steve, what part can Transport for Wales play in accelerating that transition and that modal shift? How do Transport for Wales see their role in this?
Yeah, there's a number of additional things that we can do to support what Matt was talking about there. First and foremost, I suppose we were set up originally to sort out the trains in Wales. And I think from that perspective, we've made some pretty good progress. And there's been a huge amount of investment, across Wales in new rolling stock and new stations. So from that perspective, having the alternatives to the car is really, really important. And that is obviously something that supports the mode shift. But there are other things as well. So for Andrea, for example, you mentioned about the benefits of being able to work at home. This is also something that I know the Welsh Government and this Parliament is quite keen to support, is how can we create things like remote working hubs, for example, so people have the facilities they need, but they don't have to spend half their day travelling to the office. So that's really key. And of course, the other one that I mentioned we're heavily involved in is effectively electrification. So for me, this is looking at the parts of private car travel that can't be easily transitioned, that are less susceptible to mode shift. And that includes things like vans and freight as well, and how all that can be electrified and in very short order. So what we need to do as an organisation, I suppose, is identify the different synergies between electrification for freight, for private car, for bus and taxi, and things like, co-locating charging infrastructure is one area that we can help. We've also got a very large estate of land. We've got a lot of space around stations, within stations, and greening those stations as well as using those lands to promote more sustainable station access, for example. So I've got a very long list of things I think we can support this on.
Fantastic, and that's so important to hear, Steve. So I think we really clearly set out the challenges and what we want to achieve as a country. I mean, moving on to the opportunities and the blockers to making that happen. I mean, Kate, clearly the legal framework for investment and to encourage the infrastructure that's required is absolutely critical. Well, what do you see as the key opportunities and blockers to achieving that decarbonised transport network?
Yeah, so from my perspective, if you're looking at it purely from a legal point of view, I'd say a blocker at this stage is failing to legislate at the same pace that we're developing our technologies, in particular, green renewables and decarbonised transport in terms of this talk. So, for example, if we had all of the technology and infrastructure in place to enable us to switch all of our trains to hydrogen tomorrow, then we'd have to ask ourselves the question whether law, as it currently stands, would actually allow us to do this. And what you'll find is often the law will lag behind this innovation and is in constantly catch-up mode. And if I just give some examples, you can see this with smart technology. So, for instance, only recently there's been a change in law banning the use of smartwatches whilst behind the wheel of a vehicle. Smartwatches weren't considered in the particular piece of law when it was drafted because that was used for banning mobile phones, which were relatively new at the time. So smartwatches didn't even exist, so they weren't a consideration. So the law has had to catch up with this innovation as things have moved along. And as I say, that's quite common. We've got legislation going back to like Elizabeth I regarding trusts in the Tudor period, and we've just updated that rather than just get rid of it, etc. It's just how the law works in quite a lot of scenarios. However, we can use this option as an opportunity here, because even though it is a real challenge for legislators to keep pace, so in, for example, Welsh Senedd, etc., to keep pace with this technologically fast-paced world, we've got the opportunity here to act in a positive and proactive way and introduce legislation now at the starting point of this journey, rather than trying to play catch-up in 5-10 years' time when we've hit 2030. We might not have hit our targets of where we want to be at that point. So we should be emulating the successes we've had with, for example, the implementation of the Future Generations Act. So with the Future Gens Act, we were the first country in the world to implement any legislation of this type, and it's now being used as a benchmark by other countries looking to deliver this similar legislation. So we have the real opportunity here to be world leaders again, but in this context, decarbonised transport systems, but only if we act now. We're going to we'll lose our placement if we basically don't get on, in my opinion.
And do you think that action is happening within that legal framework? I mean, clearly, like you say, we've had some fantastic achievements with the implementation of Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, and to continue that world-leading credentials, you'd say we act. Do you think there's more can be done in that respect?
I believe so. I mean, the Welsh Government has recently released this 5-year programme, and within that it talks about creating modern legislative basis for transport in Wales, the production of a Clean Air Act consistent with WHO guidance, and also a commitment to introduce legislation to achieve that net zero target, which Matt referred to earlier, with the 2030 goals of like 63% reduction up to an 89% reduction by 2040. So those are in the sphere of what Welsh Government want to achieve in this 5-year governmental period. However, what I don't want to see happening is that getting pushed back and not being dealt with until the end of, in half a decade. Are we going to be too late? We need to be doing and putting these frameworks in place now to give not only the private but also the public sector an idea what we need to be doing in order to take everyone on the journey of decarbonisation.
Yeah, and I think that's a common theme I'm hearing, is that challenge and that impetus, particularly Matt, where you're saying about the 2030 targets being particularly challenging. That we've been doing a lot of talking about climate change, and certainly Wales has been leading the way in many respects, but we also need to act. So I guess from my perspective, Nigel, what part does academia have in that act, and what are the opportunities and blockers you see to getting that technology available to decarbonise the transport networks?
It is a very fine balancing act, isn't it, between legislation and strategy and action on the ground, I guess. And I suppose part of our role is we'll have several different facets to it, but one role that we have, I think, and so has the rest of the public sector, is evidencing So we can lead, I don't mean to say lead by example, but we can show that we can make these things work, okay? So perhaps our budgets, perhaps some people might say a bit more generous, but we fight for that money, we make good cases for it, and we hope to do good things with it. And if we can show that this is how we can make things work, and if those things then become, those mechanisms then become cheaper through economies of scale, that's a role that we can perform. Equally, if you look at battery technology, or if you look at photovoltaics, you can improve performance or improve performance for a given area. You can change materials for more efficient or more sustainable materials. And we can show that, we can build that, and then hopefully we can roll it out and it gets used. And I think that's the thing. I think the public sector has a role to play, because the general public or the commercial operators get a confidence when they start to see things operational and working, and here's some success stories. And if we are trying to decarbonize, it's all well and good universities saying, yes, look what we've done, but you've also got to make that apply to the company who look at their bottom line. And this is where joining the dots comes into it, because your transport manager or your fleet manager is now your energy manager, and your energy manager is now your transport manager and fleet manager, and it all starts to merge a little bit, and these siloed budgets that used to exist are now very muddied. So you have to look for your investments, I suppose, look where you're spending your money and see if it might return by a different channel that you weren't expecting it to. But you've got to look at the bigger, more holistic picture. And I hope that the universities can play some kind of role in that, together with the local authorities and local government. And I think those collaborations, hopefully, should reap dividends. It's also fairly important to say that a lot of this is already proven in concept now. It's about adoption, and on a personal level, some people really want to, some people really don't want to. There is still a lot of misconception and preconception. So there's an educational piece. I'm not saying that you need a university degree in electric vehicles, but there's an educational piece at a wider level to show the benefits and the reasons behind doing this. And there are some really hard-hitting points which can be made. It's a bit cheesy, but every day globally, we take something like 96.2 million gallons of oil out of the ground every day, and burn it, about 70% of it every day. And if you stop and think about that, that's for not, what were we thinking? So it's definitely time to do something different and look for things, see the challenge as opportunity. I think it is one thing we could look at.
Yeah, fantastic. And
can I add to that, actually? Sorry, Andrea.
Yeah, go for it, Jamie.
I was going to say, I totally agree with what Nigel's saying, is that there is a lot of technical solutions that are already available, but I think that there's potential for not being joined up end to end. So I think in many cases that collaboration is needed, which is sometimes very difficult to achieve. But I think it is a massive opportunity, and blowing our own trumpet, but I think that Costain is probably well placed as an integrator in the space, so bringing that sort of private and public sector together and supporting that planning and design and delivery of sort of complex programs. Just to give an example, and I appreciate that Ben has not been able to join us so far, but Welsh Water, the hydrogen production facility in the Cardiff area, which is currently in development stage, and Costain is supporting Welsh Water in pitching for funding for this facility, which, if built by the mid-2020s, would be able to produce circa 2,000 kilograms of hydrogen, field-grade hydrogen a day, which would be enough for about 100 buses. On the flip side of that, we're also involved heavily with Cardiff Council to try and determine the potential future demand of fuel-grade hydrogen for sort of heavy-duty and critical response vehicles. And I know, Steve, you kindly helped us in giving your opinion as part of that study. The idea being obviously to establish the security of demand needed to support the investment in the production facility. And on sort of following on from that, we're now looking to support the delivery of an initial fuel cell EV pilot with Cardiff Council and potentially a wider public sector within Cardiff Capital Region. So examples, there's potentially the switch for 6 Charles Conley buses doing the Cardiff City to Cardiff Airport bus route, which offer a perfect fit for hydrogen fueled option. Add on potentially there's 500 critical response 24/7 police cars from South Wales, combined volume of refuse collection vehicles across Newport, Cardiff, Vale of Glamorgan, plus potentially a sort of set percentage, maybe even 30% of Cardiff buses' future fleet suddenly bringing all that together, you've met your 2,000 kilograms of daily hydrogen production that Ben would have needed at Welsh Water to make this production facility. So I think there's an enormous amount of moving parts to this kind of thing, which is insurmountable. But I feel it'd be much easier to deliver quicker with a sort of a driver at the helm.
And it's what I'm hearing is that there are lots of solutions. We have all the technology available. And sort of Matt, from your work with South East Wales Transport and the Commission, and looking at how we can think about our networks differently, where do we think the priorities are in terms of investment to deliver that decarbonisation? Where do we think the greatest opportunities are?
I think it's a bit of a question of whether it should be government-led or private practice-led. EVs undoubtedly have to play a big part in our mix to get to 2050 and step along the way to 2030. But the difficulty for government is that it's also then supporting propping up private car use, which goes against that Wales transport strategy message that I was talking of earlier. So I think that there's a conflict there within Welsh Government as to what horse it backs, where it puts its money. I think the private sector may well pick it up further themselves, and I think that the game is moving on in terms of the cars themselves. Ranges are increasing. The range anxiety is going away. There's less and less need, I think, for people to be charging away from their homes or away from places that they visit, the shops, that kind of thing. So I think the concern that we had about on-street charging and this kind of thing, wires trailing across pavements and that sort of thing, might not be such a big issue that we thought it was. But obviously that's coming from the point of the low percentage of EVs that we've got in the fleet at the moment. If we've got a 70% plus transition of that fleet, then we could be back to those same problems, and the charging infrastructure could quite easily be overloaded. But I'm quite optimistic that the private sector will embrace it, really, in terms of putting in infrastructure at shops. You're much more likely to go to one supermarket over another if they're offering you a free charge. It's then, I suppose, a question of how that energy can be sourced, and it goes upstream to there, and how we connect the dots to green the grid. And then, from my sort of armchair view of getting into that hard end of things, there's lots of options there in terms of vehicle to grid technology and EVs being able to actually level out some of the demands on the network. I'm sure others might be a bit more expert than me to talk about that further, but I think we will find a way. But I see that as, and I would say that offloading it as government, but to be a bit more private sector led. I don't know if others would have a different view.
Yeah, and to be fair, Matt, that's kind of, I think, a view that's quite welcome. I think historically private sector sometimes feel a bit arm's length in these discussions. So, there are certainly opportunities for organisations to be able to invest. Steve, I think you've got experience in this, haven't you, around public investment and private car use?
Yeah, I mean, Matt's touched upon there a lot of the issues which are, really key to this debate. And I won't name names, but in terms of public investment propping up private car use, that was our concern, that other countries in Europe have taken that approach of, wholesale transformation and sticking in loads and loads of electric vehicle charge points at great public expense for private motorists, ones that can afford electric cars, which is still a small segment of society. So I think that was something that for us was a real concern. While electrification, particularly electrification of private car use, the Committee for Climate Change identifies that as an absolutely key contributor to the emission cuts that's going to be needed in the next 5-10 years. how do we do it without spending loads of public money? So our approach so far has really been looking at how we can enable the private market to do this, and that's things like assembling packages of land that they can build upon, identifying and doing the hard work of, corralling a number of landowners and a consistent sort of framework for, a legal basis for them to do it, looking at how to clarify the planning system so that there's fewer obstacles. I think all of those things can be done at, minimal cost to the public purse. And so, in 5-10 years, I would hope that charge points are like petrol stations. They don't require public money to keep sustaining. They are the private motorists themselves that are paying for it.
Yeah, one of the things that's quite interesting is in Holland, in terms of the way that the municipalities work in Holland, they have a 50-50 split between them saying we want to put charging infrastructure here, and then offering literally to the free market to say, you tell us where you want to put charge points and we'll give you the land. So it's a really interesting model that seems to be working very well. I mean, it's in its start of its journey in Holland, but it's a really interesting model, I think.
Yeah, and clearly that supports the supply and demand then as well, Steve, as a private business looking to invest. But I guess from my perspective then, how does that mean we all, like you say, have an equal opportunity to access new forms of energy? And I think this comes all the way back to the society we have, which is we've got quite a rural base as well as the urban areas like Cardiff. There's a large proportion of our country is rural. How do we challenge some of those really big challenges around decarbonisation in those rural networks that are so heavily reliant on the car? Jamie, is that one you can?
Well, it's interesting because obviously, one of the things that we did as part of this study for Cardiff was looking at the bus network. Obviously, with the view of hydrogen, but obviously, clearly, the view is that sort of anywhere between 70% and 60-70% of the future Welsh bus operating network will be battery electric vehicles. 1,600 buses in Wales. I mean, if this modal shift, which I think is absolutely spot on, but if you're going to try and move people away from their cars, before COVID, the number of licensed cars in Wales went up by 1.5% between 2018 and 2019, and the IPPR has said that on the sort of road past the pandemic, there is a potential for car use in the UK to go up by 11% by up to 2050, which is an enormous amount. So there is still a challenge around how do you shift people away from cars. And with Wales being such a rural country in many areas, it's a real challenge, because how do I move from A to B? How do I go to the shops if I'm not using a car? Because my local shop is 10 miles away. So I think that there is if you do want to start to reduce the volume of cars, you need to improve public transport. And I think the problem that the bus operators have in Wales, and not just Wales but elsewhere, is the fact that many of those big bus operators are reliant on funding. Their business strategy is we will follow the funding. And with COVID having hit them massively, I think there needs to be some government support in order to restart that industry, so that actually it's going to hit those 2028 targets that Welsh Government have got in place to decarbonise the public transport.
Yeah.
Jamie, there is government support. The bus emergency scheme through COVID has put a lot of money into bus. But I do agree, something has to happen. Bus reform was on the agenda during the last administration, and it didn't make it through for one reason or another. Brexit and complications around that, and demands on legislative teams. But I think it is very much back again this term, and I'm confident it will get through. Bus is such a complicated ecosystem, lots of stakeholders, there's people all over the place. It's very complicated. Through the South East Wales Transport Commission, we tried to grasp the nettle on it, but we didn't come up with an easy answer there. All we could say was that something needs to improve, and there needs to be more of a guiding mind around bus to be able to direct where services are and when, and then hopefully increase patronage. It's a virtuous circle. You make the services better, you increase the patronage, then they're more self-sustainable financially, and it keeps on getting better. So something's got to give, and I think that's I'm quite optimistic on bus. I think there's a big opportunity around it going forward. It's fairly cheap and quick to implement, to make infrastructure changes, service changes. It's all within our powers. It can connect communities a lot more readily than rail, because you can have more frequent stopping points. So that fits in with the sort of localism, 20-minute communities, all that sort of agenda that's coming through. So I think that there's quite a bright future ahead for bus, but it's going to rely on legislation change to simplify it, and then investment, public and private, to make it real gold standard stuff.
And I guess as well, Matt, back to your original point about reducing that need to travel. So technology, I assume, has a really big part to play in that. So things like on-demand services and providing services locally that people can access, like we are today. I had my vaccine just down the road from me. I didn't have to travel very far from that. And when my daughter had an online consultation, I was with her, but she saw a doctor in person on screen, and she was able to have that access to those services through technology without having to leave the house. So do you see that whole kind of reducing the need to travel and that travel hierarchy? Do you see technology playing a priority part in that?
Yeah, massively. Where there's been some successful trials of a flexi system, on-demand bus system in Newport, and that's been extended to other areas now, I believe. And so people have much better confidence that the bus is going to turn up, which very often isn't the case. I've been caught out on that myself a few times. So technology solutions are definitely going to help. It's live tracking of buses. That's fairly commonplace now to be able to do that. Integrated ticketing, tap on, tap off, just making it much easier. It's there in London. It's TfW are on the case, I think, with bringing that to Wales. Just making it the easy choice, convenient choice, and that reduces your likelihood then to own a car, a second car, or a car at all, if you've got the confidence that you've got the access to the services. Because you get Sunday services and the like, where buses are every 2-3 hours plus, and it just doesn't fit with people's lives at the moment. But to be able to offer that high frequency service, it gets back to that demand. You've got to have the patronage, and we're a small country with a small population. It is a challenge in the less populated areas, but that's where technology and flexible on-demand services can play a part, and that sort of merges into automation, and where taxis are going around that, and ride sharing, Uber share. It's not in Wales at the moment, I don't believe, but it's growing in places where, and that's sort of blurring the boundaries between taxi services and bus services, and they could all play their part in more sparsely populated areas.
Absolutely, and I suppose, Kate, from a legislative perspective, this must be a bit of a minefield, that blurring of services, ride sharing, integrated ticketing, where everybody, we've got this integrated, consistent service. What part can organisations like yourself play in enabling those services to happen?
As you say, I think it's coming a bit full circle. So you went from nationalisation to privatisation, and then we've had the COVID pandemic, and massive drop off on numbers, and the private companies are just simply not able to survive. And so to save those services, it's step back in, and nationalisation is back on the agenda for a lot of these kind of public transport companies. It's picking back up on the bus point. I understand as part of the 5-minute government plan, there's now going to be a lift on the ban on local authorities setting up municipal bus companies. So you're kind of going back to that hyper local approach, where people are setting out, your local community. We want people in the local communities, and how can we best serve those local communities, which might be or might not be best suited to be met by the local authorities. But it's kind of when these wobbles are coming in, the state is stepping back in and trying to walk these companies through it and protect our services to go on. We've got the metro in South Wales, which they're looking hopefully achieving also in North Wales, and it's just, as you say, it's a lot of law to unpick and rebuild back up again, etc. And you're going to have to look at things if companies become nationalised again. You know, you've got procurement considerations, etc. that you'll have to take into account. You can't just go and sign a contract with whoever you want. But you can use that to your advantage as well. And I mean, you've got things like TOMs, which the Welsh Government will have to be used to, but also like companies like Transport for Wales who have that public element, where they can use that kind of procurement services for good and push the sustainable agenda. So basically with TOMs in procurement processes, you've basically got to assess and compare the benefits of like the multiple submissions you get for new work as a means of assessing and awarding projects. And that's based on social value, which in this context, which we'd be interested in, would be including climate change. So that the use of TOMs require Welsh Government and other organisations such as Transport for Wales and local authorities, you know, looking to provide these municipal bus companies to think about the long-term impact of their decisions. And in this context, so whether the right decisions being made in relation to developments of these decarbonised transport systems. And so it's kind of helping local authorities might be looking at companies that could be providing buses, and one of them might be providing electric buses, and the other ones might be providing diesel, and they would have to take into consideration, well, what's the social benefit here? You know, looking at climate change and all of our decarbonisation goals, maybe we should be going for the electric rather than diesel. And it's like how we kind of put that all in place to kind of work all together nicely to fit into this decarbonisation model.
Yeah, fantastic, Kate. And I guess just for my benefit, Kate, TOMs?
It is. I did write it down earlier just because everything is all full of acronyms. It basically stands for theme, is described by a set of outcomes and supported by a number of measures. So it's basically themes, outcomes, measures, and it's a way of analysing the benefit of each kind of submission against those three aspects.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. I've learned something new today. Thank you,
Andrea. Can I come in on the sort of rural issue? I guess there's a whole different set of issues that the rural communities face, but they're well placed for community energy schemes, and they're well placed for usually a bit more space, less space limitations. So you can imagine farm buildings, outbuildings, etc., tractor sheds, cow sheds. You can imagine a lot of surface areas there which could take photovoltaics, and a lot of site space that could take battery storage. And also rural areas tend to have fluctuations in tourism, so you'd have quite a large tourist industry during the tourist season, which again, that has an underlying workforce that usually start at 6 or finish at 10, which a bus service doesn't necessarily fit. So joining the dots of all these things together, where you've got potentially local generation. There are some excellent examples in Carmarthenshire. There's an excellent example just down the road from me, Gower Power Cooperative, community-owned local energy scheme. You can buy that energy based on your postcode, and there are 2 electric charge points there. And now there's a community horticulture and marketplace, and it becomes a hub, and all of a sudden you can integrate these things, and it starts to make a lot of sense. And these are the kind of things that I'd like to see maybe Welsh Government helping with, and I know there are lots of plans for intermodal hubs, and also if you're really looking at it, when I get into and not that I'm against bus or train or any kind of transport systems, I really enjoy going to cities that have got really good transport system. But when I go to get in my car, I don't need to stand in the rain for 20 minutes waiting for my car to turn up, okay? So considering the conditions and the safety of people waiting for buses, keeping them warm, dry, safe and lit, I think is a really important part of encouraging people across. And there's another education piece there. So as people do catch buses, if there's something going on some kind of screen or something in the shelter that gives some stats on the differences between 30 people on a bus and 30 cars with 1 person, or if somebody's able to take their bike on the bus a bit easier, or if it's an electric bus, how that bus is performing against a conventional diesel bus, just to get people thinking more about it.
And I think that's a really important point, isn't it, Nigel, that you know, none of us are going to make it happen. It's the public, it's everybody that's going to make this happen by making better choices. Steve, how are Transport for Wales going about that and helping people make those better choices and sort of understand the benefits of using the train as opposed to the car, to encourage that modal shift? You know, so many people now are making choices based on the green agenda and the information that's being presented to them. So how's that impacting on Transport for Wales? And you're up. We've had the first one, guys. We've had our first speaker on mute.
You knew it had to be me as well. Well, I was going to say that we've actually managed to get this far through the debate without talking about COVID. But of course, from a perspective of encouraging more people onto trains, that's been hugely problematic for us for the past year. So, you know, we do have plans, and we had plans about how we would create that, you know, that wider education piece that Nigel's talking about. What we have now obviously been focusing on is that return of passengers and what that looks like, and how both that can be COVID safe now and in the future. So in a way, the lessons we get from that about how we instill trust in passengers is really, really useful, because it is exactly that. The equivalent of the lonely bus shelter is the lonely station, or the antisocial behaviour on the train. So I think all of those things, and understanding the more hidden barriers to using public transport, you know, and that obviously applies for a range of disabilities as well. You know, it's much more than step-free access stations. So I think all the learning that we've done through COVID and all the sort of trauma that's put on industry, on the public transport industry in general, will stand us in really good stead about how we create this new education piece and encouragement piece to getting people back onto public transport. So it's still very much for us a work in progress.
That's fantastic to hear, Steve. And just going back to a point that Nigel, you were making around energy networks. Clearly, energy networks used to be, you know, big power stations. Some of them not, some of them coal, some of them gas, nuclear power stations. And where we get into this, touching on Kate's point, actually, this hyper-local approach and the localised community energy scheme. From your perspective, Jamie, you know, those energy networks that we need to make this happen, what do we see as the future of those networks, and how's that going to be enabled?
Oof. Well, I mean, I suppose the panacea is going to be, isn't it, where I've got a house with solar panels on the roof, and I've got a battery storage, and I've got a battery on my driveway as well, and I'm actually got some clever bit of kit inside my house that's optimizing the power flow between all of those different units. So that's I suppose that would be great. But I mean, we are seeing more and more organisations that are looking at kind of microgrid solutions where they've got on-site generation and they've got battery storage. And so if you take an example like the Oxford Super Hub, which is taking sort of connections straight from the transmission lines, building battery storage, and then also putting in some quite chunky EV charging hubs as well. So I think the future definitely is looking more decentralized. So, I mean, we're still going to need, unfortunately, our Hinkley Point C, which is going to give us 7% of the UK's baseload electricity. But the more, as Nigel mentioned, the more community energy programs we have in place that allow for localized generation to serve local people, the better. And I think that there's a lot of private investors out there who are keen to get involved in these kind of schemes. So I think the future's bright, and I think, you know, as you said, we've from 2008, where we had 5% of the UK that was being powered by renewable energy, we're now at 35%. So the government incentive schemes followed on by private investment, it showcases what can happen to transition away from dirty old coal. So I think the future's looking bright. I mean, I don't have any specific expertise in actually this, and I'm sure Nigel probably has got more to talk on this, but that's my view on things.
And just very quickly, I know, sorry, Nigel, Kate, you've got experience in community groups, and that must be a huge challenge for communities, is those that really do want to make the transition, that really do want to change. You know, I know major organisations like Transport for Wales are working really hard to make a difference, but what kind of challenges do communities face in accessing those funding streams and looking at the right blends of energy for their communities?
Yeah, so I think that Nigel can pick up directly after me on this point. but acting for community groups with installation of renewable energy tech, such as solar panels on community buildings like schools and libraries, etc., or installing wind turbines in the farmer's field and then using that energy generated to sell back to the grid and using that money then for community schemes. For example, installing EV charging points and car sharing clubs, as you say, to end that reliance on transportation schemes that public transport, such as buses that turn up every 2 hours, etc. It's a kind of club share with EV and stuff like that. But what's happened is, since the removal of feed-in tariffs quite a few years ago now, but they were legacy, so they've only just really started to come to the end, that has really decimated community energy groups in being able to show their bankability of a project and then knowing like how much money they're going to be getting back each year for the life cycle of their project in order to pay back the debt finance or the loans that they've had to take out to build out these projects, because they're very expensive. I mean, you're looking at a single wind turbine and you're looking into the hundreds of thousands in some instances, depending on how much energy it generates or how many megawatts it is. So the removal of that feed-in tariff has made it a lot more uncertain in the amount of money that they can generate back, and there's not as much money as previously. And there were government initiatives and schemes and loans and grants available, which are harder and harder to come by. And I think that if we want to support basically our community energy groups, it's kind of threefold. It's working with sectors like and companies like big companies like Welsh Water, for example, providing them with potential PPAs for electricity to sell to big industries that are using a lot of electricity and energy, and that will improve its bankability of the project. Or you've got the state intervention with helping with grants and loans and a stable income for them to be able to pay back. And you basically then have just got to be supporting these people to help their communities, because primarily they're going to be based rurally. They know their local areas best and how best to help them out, and that will kind of help that whole decarbonisation strategy of the rural hard to reach sector. I don't know, Nigel, if you want to pick up anything further on that.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kate. Well, just my work with our work with the networks is limited. My knowledge of the networks is limited, but we have done some we've done some projects with the local and regional networks. So if you look at EV charging, for example, if everybody plugged in their electric car at the same time on an evening, I mean, everybody knows this, so I won't. Well, I'll have to repeat it now, won't I? But anyway, as everybody plugs their electric car at the same time, it's going to fry the network. Okay, that's a common. It's true, but it's a misconception because it doesn't happen. And the same thing would happen if everybody switched their kettle on at the same time. Okay, it's just about timing things. So if you apply that to EV charging and look at smart EV charging systems, either by choice or automated, you can flatten out peaks and troughs and give a smoother a grid line, a smoother baseline, which might in the end stop somebody having to fire up a gas-powered power station temporarily just to feed a peak. Okay, so there is a role to play with, again, join the dots, working with the regional and national distribution networks. And the community points you mentioned, Kate, with community car schemes, again, absolutely great. That gets people out of cars. We're trying to get one launched where I live now. And I'm seeing the sort of same reasons why it wouldn't work for people as why they're saying an electric car wouldn't work for them or an electric van wouldn't work for them. So there's quite a bit of education piece. Cost is an issue that we haven't really mentioned. So there's costs for and against. So I'll give you a little example. I had to get 3 people back to London. We looked at the train. Sorry, Steve, we looked at the train. It was going to be knocking on, at the times that was right for them, knocking on 800 quid to send 3 people to London. Okay. We went in an electric car. Fortunately, one of the charge points was on Freevend. The car had the range to go to London non-stop. The round trip for 3 there, 1 back, was 8 quid. So, all right, so it took me a bit more time. But these are the kind of cost comparators that we need to work on and try and make mass transport, public transport, perhaps more attractive to people. I've gone off topic now, but there was one point I wanted to try and get to, which was, it's been mentioned, for the people who can afford an electric car. Okay, that's a really good point, because we are at danger. We're already a very polarized society, and there is a real danger here of exaggerating the polarization. So how do we work in the communities where they can't afford a Tesla, or there isn't off-street parking? How does the Welsh government and local authorities and companies like Costain, how do we work to address those issues so that everybody's got a chance? So your one-person florist or your one-person plumber has got the opportunity to decarbonise should they want to, and it stacks up for them. So that's a big couple of dots to join up there. I think somewhere where we need to work.
Nigel, I'd say it's getting there. You know, I bought a Nissan Leaf a year or so ago. Cost me less than 10 grand. You know, so not crazy money, and the fuel savings kind of pay it back. You know, so and there's government incentives on buying vehicles now. I think the price of the cars is coming down. The tipping point of whether it's more value for money to buy a diesel or petrol versus electric is kind of there. There was a threshold of $100 per kilowatt hour of battery or something like that. That's just recently been passed, doesn't it? And that's only going to keep going south. So I think we're near at the place where the purchase price of the vehicle is equivalent, and then the running costs are, as you say, you know, 20% if less of the equivalent diesel. So I think it will start stacking up for people. But the problem
and I'm in the same boat as you. I've got a second-hand Nissan Leaf, and it's great. You know, I don't go to the petrol station anymore. I haven't done for some time, but I can charge probably as you can at home. Okay, I can take advantage of something like an Octopus Go tariff, where for 4 hours of the night I'm only paying 5 pence per kilowatt. And whereas if I didn't have off-street parking, I'd be at the mercy of the public charging network, and I might be paying 30 or 40p. And that's a disadvantage based on the fact I can't park. So I'd like to see some imaginative solutions to this, and see if we can, instead of making local authorities be responsible for putting in charge points, hand it to the commercial sector, as has already been mentioned, but somehow have some kind of, maybe a subsidy, I don't like the word, but maybe a subsidy based on your postcode that says, okay, this guy hasn't got off-street parking, can't charge at home, but so we'll subsidize a degree of his charging as if he could or she could. And that would encourage the commercial sector as well, plus get around the problem of people who've got no off-street parking. If you look at South Wales Valleys in particular, there's an awful lot of terraced housing where people don't have the opportunity to plug in at home and get the advantages that I certainly do.
Yeah, so it's a really important issue, actually, Nigel, you know, that affordability for everybody, and making sure that we all have access to those networks. So, you know, I know that's a really important factor, both in the development of our transport networks, but also the operation of them for organisations like TfW. You know, clearly we've just said all those technologies are available, and I think it's where you started, Nigel, was about the economics of scale and about how we make it affordable. But, you know, in terms of the next steps, what do we think those next key technology advances are required that will help us with that transition? Clearly we've got electric charging points, and there are some challenges around affordability there. Steve, what are the big technology challenges that you face as an organisation for decarbonising your network?
So in terms of the scale of the challenges, sometimes these seem like very simple things. So, you know, I used to live in a house that, as Nigel described it, it had no off-street parking, and demand for parking was so great that sometimes you'd have to park 2 or 3 streets away. So, you know, these are all things that are going to have to be cracked. And at the moment, we don't have commercially available solutions for things like that. We have to be honest, you know, not everyone at the moment can get an electric car because they will simply have nowhere to charge it. And even on-street charge points would have to be available to everyone, almost at every lamppost, almost between every lamppost, because it would have to address every single space if you're going to be guaranteed to charge. So, simple things like that are things that we want to see much more from industry, because the market for that is enormous. If we're going to reach the number of overnight charge points that are going to be required, those things have to be fixed. In terms of the much bigger challenges, when we start thinking about decarbonisation of heavy vehicles, so starting with large taxis right up to buses and trains, again, the solutions are missing there, really. We know that only a fraction of bus routes in Wales, because of their operational patterns, are really suitable for electrification. So, if we've put in electric charging at every depot, then we will only cover a small part of the country. So then we move on to things like hydrogen, and how do you get the hydrogen to the dozens and dozens of depots for operators both small and big, particularly in rural Wales? Does that get tankered in? Does it get the pipeline? The storage of hydrogen is nothing like the storage of compressed or liquefied natural gas, for example. So whole new thing. And in terms of hydrogen, just on that point, I wonder what the synergies are between hydrogen use for things like heavy vehicles, which electrification is not suitable for, and potential for space heating, because there is at the moment obviously a debate about should we just effectively try and swap out natural gas for things like space heating and cooking in domestic environments, or do we have to rip out everyone's infrastructure in their homes, their whole heating systems, and put in things like air and ground source heat pumps? So these are really big things that needs both strong pointers from UK government, I suppose, primarily, but also more innovation from industry, because at the moment the solutions for the short timescales that we're working to, the 2028, the 2030 targets, they're just not fully there. So that I think is the most urgent challenge.
And Jamie, from your perspective, those larger vehicles doing hydrogen, clearly we've got this challenge around electric vehicles and domestic vehicles. But when it comes to those larger vehicles, so your trains and your buses where electrification isn't possible, does hydrogen present a realistic alternative?
Yes, it does. Definitely. I appreciate that hydrogen is further down the track in terms of technology advances, but it's catching up quickly. Obviously, there's plenty of manufacturers, OEMs, looking at hydrogen fueled FCEV HGVs as well as buses. Obviously, we've got Wrightbus based in Northern Ireland that are happily producing or looking to produce volumes of hydrogen fueled EVs going forward. So I think the other, just thinking not so much, because HGVs and buses, we've got 500,000 of those in the UK. We've got 31 million cars and 5 million vans, and so it's the focus on the smaller vehicles it's really important. And I appreciate we're talking about modal shift and trying to reduce those numbers, but actually where I think the other piece that I think is a challenge is actually the volume, that those depot-based vehicles where you've got large numbers of vehicles at a single site that need to be charged. So there's grid connectivity issues. So some of those large logistics companies, I think it's one of the biggest headaches for your DPDs, etc. is it's just how do I charge the volume of vehicles that we've got flying around the country, and so I think that the technology advances in having some really smart energy systems is going to be important. I think at the moment we're probably seeing a lot of charge point companies who are putting in the same dynamic load management systems, and they're putting in their own technology. But I think going forwards, this idea of taking a step back and putting in a foundational, quite flexible system. So going forward, you might be putting in sort of 7 and 22 kilowatt AC charging now. In the not too distant future, we'll be putting in DC charging, and it's having that system that will allow you to be flexible and mix and match the kind of charge points you want to put in as our technology advances. And I think that's really important, that invest now in that foundational system that allows you then to chop and change going forwards and add to what you put in, rather than having to rip it all out and start again.
Yeah, and it's really interesting talking about it. Again, we're back to investing in those local foundations to make it happen, that enable joining the dots. So needing those solutions from private industry, but also the big demand organisations to uptake usage. So, you know, what do we think is the role? You know, we're talking about joining the dots here and some of the challenges we face. You know, how can we all work together, public and private sector, to advance the agenda? And we touched on it a little bit, Matt, about how, you know, certainly from your perspective, you see private business being a great enabler in terms of the investment. But I'm assuming that you would want to see Welsh Government, for instance, providing the framework so you didn't have a free-for-all of electric charging points across Wales. And like Nigel said, those disparities in the pricing structure, you know, how can we build a structure that enables people to have access, but also provides access to private business to a great market, such as electric charging points?
I think the answer to that really lies in better regional working. That's an ambition of this government, really, is to make things work on a regional basis better, and that ties in with that Wales Transport Strategy. So we've got the Burns Development Unit set up in Transport for Wales alongside Steve, and they are leading on some measures like Cardiff to Newport cycle routes and bus routes, enhancing the infrastructure, so all the players in the market get a benefit. The bus operator, the end user, they all get a better service, more competitive service. But the change there is that we are providing TfW as the intelligent resource to support the local authority, to support Welsh Government in achieving both their objectives, national, regional and local, in delivering measures and delivering them to a high quality, you know, rather than active travel in the past relying on one man or one woman and their dog who are doing it in local authority and hitting hurdles and that's leading to poor delivery. So there's a new way of working there. I think the metro programs, again in TfW, are fostering the same approach to support local authorities and Welsh Government to work collaboratively, and that's, you know, at the moment really that's focused on rail to date. We're bringing that more into the bus and active travel space with the things that we're doing on the Burns Development Unit, and the same model could apply to EV infrastructure and looking at how we do that on a regional basis. And that could expand into sort of private practice opportunities to come into that. So I think that there's a model there that can look at these things differently, and sort of bring governments together as one government. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, to try and do things in a better way.
I think, Matt, that's not a bit cheesy at all. I think that should be the new strapline. One government would be fantastic for anybody. You know, those local, the regional, the Welsh Government working together to provide that structure is really important, because that particularly for businesses that are looking to invest, that can be particularly challenging, is navigating the complexities of those relationships. And so from a private perspective,
another good example is remote working. You know, it gets back to that avoiding and reducing the need to travel. You know, government.
Well, I think we might have our first Wi-Fi breakdown, everybody. We've got a frozen Matt. Whilst we're waiting for him to rejoin, Kate, I knew that you had some things you wanted to add about the hydrogen point.
Yeah, that's right. It was just going back really to the whole supply and demand point, which I think we touched upon a little bit earlier, and especially in the case of hydrogen, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation at the moment, where you've got work being undertaken and development of hydrogen vehicles, and there are hydrogen enabled buses, for example, up in Scotland, and I think I alluded to earlier about in Northern Ireland. And there's hydrogen HGV capable vehicles as well. And when you're going to be looking at kind of big heavy goods vehicles and the transportation system, which is going to get more and more important as we're ordering everything online these days, and the distribution systems are only going to become more important. You're going to be looking at big freight vehicles going up and down the whole of the UK to deliver these goods to warehouses, etc. And so where it's decided that electrification of these vehicles is probably not the best, whereas if you've got hydrogen, it carries energy far better than a battery, and so the bigger the vehicle will benefit from this. However, the issue we've got is where you have not any hydrogen charging infrastructure apart from a few points dotted around very briefly, I think mostly around London. And so without the infrastructure in place, you don't have the companies and private sector developing the vehicles, because they're saying there's no infrastructure, and yet the infrastructure developers are saying, well, there's no point installing infrastructure because there's no vehicles. And so it's like, who breaks first? And so I think it's a shame that Ben's not here from Welsh Water and what was mentioned earlier, like working on these big projects to enable the hydrogen production. And what should also be remembered is, you know, you've got the different types of hydrogen, and so if you're looking at it from a decarbonisation, you're going to want it from a green hydrogen source, so via, you know, electrolysis, etc., rather than via blue hydrogen, unless you're utilising carbon capture and storage from that process. Until we've got that enabled, it's just going to keep on languishing, in my opinion.
There's Matt.
Just following on from that, the work that we did with Cardiff was to do exactly that, to try and get that security of demand through different entities who said, look, hydrogen could definitely be the solution for us, and making sure that so from Ben's perspective, who's here today, said, in order for me to progress with this fantastic program, we need to get that surety of investment through actually the offtake, through buying this hydrogen. And so, you know, the next stage, hopefully, that we're going to work with Cardiff Council and potentially with the wider capital regions at some point is to understand how we can build that pilot that's almost the starting point to get this program over the line. I think what's great about that is that it's a whole bunch of different stakeholders that are involved, whether it's you know, the police force, or whether it's Cardiff Council or Newport Council or Vale Glamorgan, a bit of Costain. There's Formzella in there from a manufacturer perspective, and it's bringing all these different entities together. That I think, and I think I mentioned it right at the start, that bringing them all together is collaboration is vitally important if we're going to get all these kind of programs up and running.
Yeah, and that's coming through loud and clear, Jamie, joining the dots, you know, create it from demand to the infrastructure delivery that's required to make it happen. And and like you say, Kate, which comes first? I see Matt's come back in the room. Whatever. I'm just looking at the time. It's usually this time of day when my children come home from school, load up the Wi-Fi and turn all their tech on, and everything starts grinding to a halt. And I know Matt has children, so I'm sure it's a common theme that many of us feel. You were just talking about that regional working, Matt.
Yeah, just an interesting point I just wanted to raise was about local working hubs. We touched on it a bit earlier, and there's some trials going on now, and that just demonstrates an opportunity around organisations working together. You know, public service bodies could be pooling all of their office estate, and then you go to your local one rather than going across town to your core organisation's base. You know, and if those trials are successful and sort of security levels are right, then that could be extended to private organisations as well to come in that pool of office space, and we could all be reducing our need to travel. You know, it's like Nigel was saying about the trip to London. You know, I think that the days of everyone doing that on a regular basis are going to be largely gone, because not just because of the cost of the travel, but also just the time cost. You know, where I don't know about anyone else, but we kind of fill our days out now with Teams meetings, and the thought of having half an hour plus travel time between those meetings just isn't possible. I just couldn't fit in. I couldn't afford to travel. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sort of stretching out the conversation a little bit with a slight change in tack. Clearly, skills to deliver all of this. We've spoken about joining the dots and some of the challenges there, but I'm sure, Nigel, from your perspective, you know, I went to university and learned all about civil engineering. There was a lot of concrete, a lot of stakes being driven in the ground, and technology and decarbonisation, electric charging points weren't a big part of that. So, and certainly from my work with Construction Industry Training Board, there's been some assessments on the skills required to be able to deliver on this green agenda. What role can academia play in supporting this transition, do you think?
Oh, that's an excellent point, and there's education at all levels. So you could go from primary school kids up. You could look at the further education, not just the higher education level, but further education level at vehicle technicians. You could look at in-house apprentice schemes with local authorities and their transport depots, and you can introduce decarbonised transport into those schemes and get the training in at that level. At the university level, well, I've mentioned some of the things we're doing before, which is looking at improving, maybe taking up on our printing and coating skills and adapting that to photovoltaics. And Jamie, the perfect building that you described earlier, I'm lucky enough to be sat in something like it. So the roof, it's a solar roof, it's not panels. The roof is solar with a printed curved roof on it. Innovated here in Swansea, now produced by a commercial company in Newport.
I've been there actually, Nigel.
Have you? Okay, great.
Yes.
Well, you know it then. And it provides its own power. It provides power to neighbouring buildings on a microgrid, and then the surplus we put into vehicles, because it's worth more putting into vehicles than it is selling it back to the grid, which comes back to the feed-in tariff you were mentioning earlier, and we get something like 24,000 miles out of a Nissan Leaf or a Hyundai Kona or whatever before we start pulling off the grid. So as an educational piece, that ability to demonstrate what can be done here and now in Wales, and not next week in Oslo, it's useful. And then there's compound semiconductors, there's energy management schemes, business modelling, all wrapped in around the decarbonisation topic. So yeah, I know I'd like to think we've got a role to play, and I'd like to think we're doing some of it, and we can always do better.
And just going back to those industrial clusters, then there have been some fantastic successes in Wales with those clusters, and I know, Jamie, from yours and Kate's part in Swick, what learning can we take from that could be applied to a transportation context? Perhaps this is one for you, Kate.
Yeah, I'd say that primarily what we should be taking away is collaboration. Collaboration with all parties, whether it's private sector, public sector, etc. I think that's what makes the clusters, and in particular Swick, so South Wales Industrial Cluster, work, is that we've got many different organisations from competing bodies coming together to collaborate, because they understand that this issue is bigger than any one of their organisations, and no one organisation on their own can solve these issues. It takes a joint working and effort. So I think that just collaboration cannot be underestimated, just for different viewpoints being taken from different stances, sectors, and people within the organisations. It's a multifaceted issue, and it's the same here with transport. We've got rail, we've got road, we've got aviation, which obviously hasn't been touched on, and we've got sea. And so no one company is going to be able to deal with that, and no one government. We need to have stakeholder investment in it. I don't know if Jamie wants to add anything to that.
Not particularly, no. I think you covered it very well, Kate. I was going to say exactly the same thing, that collaboration thing. And as I said, it's really interesting to see that you've got competing entities working together for a much greater and larger good, which I think is very healthy to see. And I think that we're not just seeing the South Wales industrial cluster. We've got industrial clusters all over the UK. We're in exactly the same boat. So I think that it's a brave move forward. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these progress.
Fantastic. And just back to that collaboration point, Matt, clearly that's coming through loud and clear today. It's fantastic with governments working together regionally to join those dots. What can Welsh Government learn from the private sector, and how can Welsh Government work more collaboratively with private industry to make all this happen? Big question, Matt. I know, a very big question.
I think it's about how dynamic governments can be. Sometimes they're a big machine and they get stuck in their own bureaucracy, whereas private organisations can sometimes move quicker. But it depends on what you're talking about. If it's in times of crisis, we're going back to COVID, things can be done more quickly. And I'm encouraged by things like the hub trials, because we're keeping a watch on that through the Burns unit. It was a Burns recommendation. So the unit are keeping a watch on the department, the Welsh Government that are organising this. And I checked in on it recently, and I thought, they're not going to have got up to much by now. They'll have written a couple of papers on it or something. But fair play to them, they're cracking on, and the trials are out there now. There's about 8 or 12 trials happening. So, maybe government can move fast when it wants to, and that comes from the top. The ambition and the drive that's there from ministers all the way down. And it's clear that the ministers we've got in place here are really, really committed to climate change and making things happen. If you hear the award speak, he's incredibly passionate, and I think it needs those strong advocates in positions of leadership to really push things through and get people working collaboratively and get the solutions that we need. So I'm really encouraged by the start that we've had in this government term, and I'm sure that will continue as we go through the next 5 years, and then hopefully the run into 2030 and hitting those decarb targets.
And clearly Wales has taken a lead in many respects on climate and through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. That commitment, and perhaps sometimes we feel ourselves perhaps a smaller nation. Do you think, Steve, we've got advantages over others in that agility and being able to move at pace?
I absolutely think so, yes. I think the fact that from our perspective, government looks quite flat and obviously very accessible, I think is really helpful. I think one of the things that was touched upon earlier is that now, as Matt mentioned, about creating that integration, this one government strapline. I think that's what's needed, because often I think the big difficulties we often have is just local authorities. They've done things their way for quite some time. And for us as a fairly new organisation, as I imagine it would be for the private sector, is understanding how each individual one of those works. So this is what we're trying to do on the EVs level, for example, when we're putting in charge points, that we have one kind of strategy where we all sign up to that, all the local authority and national delivery partners, so that industry can come and say, there you go, this is how we work. This is how charge points work in Wales. And if we can apply that and it works to other areas, I think that's how we can accelerate delivery. Yeah,
absolutely, Steve. And it's certainly from a private sector point of view, it's what I see in Wales as well, is that accessibility to decision makers, to organisations, to be able to have those conversations and move much quicker in development is something that, as a private business, we have particular challenges with very large organisations. And I guess, Nigel, from your perspective, the similar thing applies for academia. Your access to driving through change and delivering the research and development that's necessary for that future. Does it particularly work well in Wales with that agility?
Very much so. We've got some fantastic collaboration agreements with other academic organisations in Wales and with industry. And whilst it would be wrong to say that there isn't a good, healthy, competitive element to that, as there is between cities and regions, and as perhaps there should be, the collaboration that's achieved by that, if it's sort of positive competitiveness, is remarkable. You can really leverage different skill sets and different specialisms and different discoveries that are happening in certain parts of the country, and that's to the greater benefit. And I think collaboration, not just between the academic organisations but across sectors, is key to it. And it was great to hear Matt say about joined up thinking in government. And if there's a great project going on in Cardiff, which is going to sort of get hydrogen heavy goods vehicles on the road, it makes obvious sense that we learn from that and do the same here, and that joins the dots. That makes the Welsh section of the M4 capable of supporting hydrogen-powered or electrically powered heavy goods vehicles. And there's no point in doing it in one. It's like having one telephone. It's no good, is it? You need at least two.
We simply have to. We've got to collaborate, because there's a mix of where the powers are and where the funding is. Like Cardiff to Newport cycle and bus routes that the Burns unit are pushing forward on. So they're doing the design work, coming up with the options. but then they'll feed that back to both the local authorities cross-border, so multiple local authorities and Welsh Government, and the local authorities have got the powers to implement these measures, or equally not implement them if they don't wish to do them, and Welsh Government may bring the funding for it. So we have to collaborate. There's no other way of implementing these measures. We've almost had that Concord moment of the M4 Relief Road, which is major roads projects. Government can stomp its feet and come in under Highways Act and compulsory purchase and deliver things that way, and almost take it off the hands of the local authority. That can't be the way on these smaller scale but much larger number of measures that'll be coming through in delivery now in the programme for government over this 5 years and going forward. There's lots of complexity in that, lots of detail, lots of different plates spinning, but we have to have that collaboration between governments to deliver those.
Yeah, and that again, Matt, has come through loud and clear here today, that we're in a much more dynamic environment, particularly for decarbonisation, and we can't just rely on old methods to solve problems. We need to focus on the outcomes and be much more adaptable. So I think that's a really good way of wrapping up today, actually, and just some of the things that we've spoken about. Clearly, many of us haven't really thought about this until COVID came along, that how much do we actually need to travel? And do our communities need to be much more locally based with the services that we have? So as a priority, reducing the need to travel and focusing on the modal shift so that we can reduce car use and reliance on the car. Where we can't, clearly decarbonisation of our networks is something that's coming through really quickly, really clearly. And Kate, really great insight that you provided about the legislative context to make that going, and how actually to make it happen, we almost need to be ahead of the game with legislation, where technology in particular moves at such an incredible pace. Nigel, fantastic insight from you in academia about the economies of scale, that academia has some great solutions out there, but it's about you providing that evidence to private business to be able to scale up. And Steve, from a transportation perspective, from a client who deals with transport every day and has to keep us all moving, fantastic to hear about the work that Transport for Wales are doing to decarbonise the network and deal with some of these really big challenges we face, particularly in some of our older urban areas where electric charging is going to be a particular challenge. Clearly what's come through very loud and clear is that there are some technology challenges, but we have everything with the private sector and public sector in our armoury to answer this challenge for Wales. 2030 is a massive challenge for all of us, but working together, joining the dots, we're going to make it happen. So actually, I think I've left this call very buoyed, and thank you all for your time today, and thank you for the audience. I know it can be particularly challenging on these calls when you're just listening, but really appreciate your time. And if you'd like to give any feedback through the organisations, I know Sophie and the whole team would welcome that feedback. And if you want to have follow-up conversations, then please do make contact. So thank you for your time today, and enjoy the rest of the sunny afternoon.
Thank you for watching. Rewatch all of our sessions online. Thank you to our partners.